Hi everyone, here's the Book Chemist once again. Today I'm reviewing The Quiet American by Greene. I first became aware of this book when I read Denis Johnson's Tree of Smoke, a wonderful, very ambitious, masterfully written novel of the Vietnam War. Characters in that novel read The Quiet American, comment on it, are skeptical of it. In many ways, Tree of Smoke is either a sequel or a work of fan fiction in Michael Chabon's very respectful conception of the term, based on The Quiet American. This is the story of a British war correspondent in Vietnam in the early 50s, while the country is in a state of war. The French occupants are fighting the Viet Minh. They are losing the war. It's pretty clear to everyone that the French are at the end of their imperial occupation of the region, of this country, but still the war continues with all of its atrocities. Still the international situation is uncertain, several different interests are at stake, and in the midst of all this conflict, of this endless suffering, this consumed war correspondence, this protagonist has his convictions about the idea that he is not engagé, that he is just detached and witnessing the events of this war. He has his convictions shaken and rocked, mostly by the intrusion of this quiet American, of this clean, freshly graduated college kid with his books and his convictions about America's role in the world, about the role of democracy, about how democracy must be preserved at any cost. And his intrusion will cause, well, you'll have to read the book. Some books are published at just the right or just the wrong historical moment. Jonathan Franzen's The Corrections I think is all the more commendable. I do believe it's a great novel because it offers beautiful commentary on the state of contemporary America in the first years of the 21st century. Even though it was published, I think it came out the day before 9/11, even without knowledge of how that event was going to completely alter the face of everything, of public life, public discourse, personal life in the US in the 21st century. Franzen still provided a pretty convincing portrait of it all. Very similarly, this book originally came out in 1955, and still 10 years before the conflict in Vietnam officially began between the United States and the Viet Minh, North Vietnam, still Greene portrayed the horror and the absurdities of that conflict in, well, excellently clear and very understandable terms. It's ominous to read about napalm bombings in this book, knowing how much that will become a central part of the war in the decades to come, and of the way that war was being perceived abroad, of the way that war was going to alter the United States image to the world forever. Similarly, the discussions between Fowler, the protagonist, and Pyle, the quiet American, are so stimulating and so horrifying because you get this very clear sense that Pyle and America, whom he represents, don't really have a sense of what the people of Vietnam want, what their priorities are, what they wish for themselves, what they're fighting for. And again, this idea that the foreign power, that the US, don't really have a sense of what they're fighting for, are entirely disconnected with the priorities of the people they're supposedly defending, would become part of the discussion and part of the horrors of the Vietnam War. In many ways, if there is a sense that if only people had read this book when it came out in 1955, so much horror and immense suffering could have been spared, except that's not the way the world works. Novels don't save the world, and it's part of Tree of Smoke by Denis Johnson, that even people who do read these kinds of books dismiss them until they are confronted with those horrors firsthand. But look at me, sounding like a dirty new historicist, only talking about the novel in terms of its historical context. The Quiet American is an immense and incredible feat of storytelling. I really wasn't expecting to be so blown away by a novel that's so short. It's extremely thrilling. It features quite a few action scenes where the characters' lives are at stake and where you end up stuck to the pages for chapters at a time. It fluctuates, it alternates and switches backward and forward beautifully between the narrative present and the narrative past. And while it offers all those insightful reflections on the nature of colonialism, the nature of clashes between civilizations that are so different from one another, while it offers you this tense, this engaging plot, it also manages to be pretty funny. There are quite a few instances of wry arch humor in here that had me giggling like an old lady, or a young man for that matter. Part of the humor there comes from that very British penchant for talking crap about French and Americans. But even beyond that, those jabs between allies, many of the opinions expressed by the narrator, by the protagonist in this book, are quite antiquated, are actually quite horrible, especially when it comes to his relationship with Quang, the woman he takes as his companion while he lives in Vietnam, and who will play a central role in the novel. Far from me to build a defense of the protagonist's view, let alone Graham Greene's, I do believe with these things, as always, as when you always encounter these sorts of outdated, horrible views in literature, that at the same time as you condemn them, you can also learn a lot from these sorts of narratives. You can learn a lot about the way people thought in the past, the reasons why people considered women to be so different from men, considered women's mentality to be so particular, even if the only thing you learn is that people in the past were ignorant assholes. That's still a very important lesson to take to heart. Ultimately, and judging from the text, I don't think this irony is lost on Graham Greene at all. I believe that he knew when he was building his protagonist that these ironies were ingrained in the plot and in the protagonist's presentation of the plot. Ultimately, the novel's central point is that, well, we are always unable to understand fellow human beings. They could be our lovers, they could be our friends, our enemies, our allies. Eventually, we always reach a point where we cannot quite understand them. And even more tragically, we cannot really understand their suffering even when it's in front of our eyes. And that's the source of immense suffering for people. It's at the heart of the great problems that we face as not even as a civilization, as a race, as creatures living on Earth. And it's worth studying and it's worth writing about. Whether we're talking about a lover's inability to understand that his actions make his loved one suffer, or of a foreign power's inability to understand that their actions are going to hurt a given people, a given country, beyond human comprehension, even admitting that this foreign power is acting with this country's best interests at heart. I was entirely blown away by The Quiet American once again. I think it is sort of a masterpiece. I think in the economy of its word and in the economy of its action, in its presentation of the events, in the way it packs so many beautiful and complex reflections in such an elegant performance. Well, if that isn't a literary masterpiece, I'm not quite sure what is. All of a sudden, I'm very eager to read more of Graham Greene, and I'll make sure to read Our in Havana and Brighton Rock are probably at the top of my list. I'm very curious to read those, but I know he has a gigantic Hoover. He's left us quite a lot of books, and I'll be curious to dive into some of them at one point into the future. What did you think of The Quiet American? And if you've read it, what did you think of Tree of Smoke? Because Dennis Johnson is one of those authors people ask me about a lot in the comments. So let's talk about him too. Why not? Thank you as always for watching the review, guys. I look forward to discussing these books in the comment section. Bye, guys.